Hi, everybody. Welcome back. And in this lesson, we're going to talk about psychoanalytic dimensions of personality or psychoanalytic perspectives on personality. This will be the first of 8 lenses or prisms by which we look at personality theory. It is not shocking that we start with psychoanalysis because some of the earliest ideas about personality came either through Sigmund Freud or Sigmund Freud's followers. But we're going to go through it and let's see how this goes, right? So when we talk about psychoanalytic approach, we're going to be talking about personality theory based on the writings of Sigmund Freud. And if I were to highlight, his biggest emphasis is trying to understand unconscious processes in the mind. And you may remember that the unconscious were aspects of personality that we are not readily able to access, but they impact our decision-making, impact our personality. They act as elements of personality or drives that are beneath the surface that push us in a given direction. So, as I said, the unconscious is the portion of the mind that a person is not readily aware of. So, if the unconscious was the vast majority of personality, as argues Sigmund Freud, then we need to find a way to tap into the unconscious. And really, Freud used 3 different techniques. And the reason why he used various techniques is he found that some techniques work better with some individuals relative to other individuals. So the 3 major techniques that he thought you could access the unconscious with were hypnosis, free association or the talking cure, and dream analysis. So let's start with hypnosis. In the early stages of Freud's career, he used hypnosis as a way of treating patients, right? And he was working and studying neurology and psychiatry at the time, and he became one of the students of Charcot. Now, Charcot was already relatively famous in this field, and he used hypnosis as a way of treating hysteria. And hysteria, by definition, were physical or psychological impairments with no direct identifiable cause, such as a person might report arm paralysis, but there's nothing biologically wrong with them. Neuroimaging techniques today would be done and they would come back normal. But nevertheless, a person still reports having problems with moving their arm or paralysis. And hypnosis worked. Now, hypnosis, by definition, is a process where you induce a trance-like state and you're somewhat under the control of another person. Now, when I say somewhat under the control of another person, that does not mean that, like you might have seen on television, a person could get you to bark like a dog, spin on your head, and get you to do really bizarre behaviors. But what it does is it puts you in a very relaxed state where your guard is down. And typically what happens in the unconscious is these are the taboos. These are the forbidden thoughts and feelings that we push beneath the surface. But when your guard is down, hypnosis allows you to bring things from the unconscious up to conscious awareness, right? When you're in this relaxed or trance-like state. Now, I describe hysteria, some either physical or psychological impairment with no real biological cause. So hypnosis was used, but one of the biggest problems that was discovered is that it was inconsistent. Some people hypnosis worked really well with, and other people it worked really poorly with. So if we're going to try and do psychotherapy or measure the unconscious, well, these uneven results become problematic if you're trying to work and tap into the unconscious. So we have to have other tools. So Freud moves away from hypnosis due to the inconsistency. Now, today we have understood the more suggestible the person, the more gullible the person, the more open to inducement the person is, the more likely hypnosis would work. The more skeptical a person was, the less likely it would work. So hypnosis was insufficient. So move to the dreams. And Freud believed that the dreams were the royal road to the unconscious. And when we are asleep, some of the barriers that we typically have to push things beneath the surface are also relaxed. So when we're dreaming, Freud believed that we're projecting things from our unconscious mind into the world. And there were two levels of understanding content and interpretation. There was the manifest content, and the manifest content was what the dream was, whatever you reported. So tell me what you dreamt yesterday. And you would say what it meant, or what you dreamt, pardon me. The latent content, which Freud looked for symbols in, was the deeper hidden meaning of the dream. And Freud would look for all kinds of symbols, such as, I'll give you some dream symbols. If you had elongated structures, they were symbolic of phalluses or penises. If you had receptacles, they were symbolic of vaginas. If you dreamt of falling, that might be symbolic of loss of self-esteem or worth. If you lost your hair or lost teeth in a dream, that might be castration anxiety. So he puts this symbolism on the dream. Now, one of the things that Freud did that we criticize today is his approach to dream analysis. Dream analysis still occurs today, but the way we do it is very different. When Freud was doing it, he came up with a whole bunch of dream symbols and interpreted it based on his view of what those symbols were in your latent content. Today, we view the person who had the dream as the expert, and we ask them to potentially identify the hidden symbolism of the dream or why they might have dreamt the dream. So instead of me being the expert, you're the expert on you. Now, as I said, the forbidden impulses might be projected in dreams. So as I already described, the phallic-like structures are enclosed spaces as genital symbols. Now, Freud did say sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, which means that we don't always interpret things in a sexual nature. However, he tended to interpret dreams more sexually than others, but that was one of his views, right? He believed that the two basic drives were sex and aggression. So sex was an important part of his model or theory. In fact, we're going to talk about his theory of psychosexual development shortly, right? So that tells you something. Now, his dream analysis, I said, came under criticism. There are structural aspects of the mind, according to Freud as well. This is less criticized. We acknowledge the mind does have different components. Now, Freud emphasized the id, right? The id is the part of the personality structure that's based on instant gratification, based on pleasure. It tends to be less influenced by morality. So you might hear some books describe the id as immoral. I prefer to describe it as amoral, right? Not based on morality, but not necessarily immoral, right? So your basic drives, like I said, are sex and aggression. Now it's interesting, Freud typically talked about eros, which was your life force or drive towards maintaining a species, or your sex drive. So he thought that was the part of life that would push you towards growth and existence and maintaining a species. And that's all he had until World War One. When World War One came about, he understood that just like we have the capacity to push ourselves towards life and generativity and procreation, we also have this death instinct, which is the thanatos, which pushes us towards death and destruction. And obviously, when you see World War One and how many people were killed and whatnot, it's easy to understand why Freud would conceptualize thanatos. But sex and aggression are basic drives of the id. Pleasure, it operates based on the pleasure principle, and it does not delay gratification whatsoever. The ego is interesting because the ego is your sense of self. It balances the needs of the id, or the drives of the id, and the values of the superego. So it's a mediator. It also helps us with defense mechanisms, cope with anxiety. It operates based on the reality principle. Now, you're going to see some of Freud's students and followers and contemporaries shift away from the id to the ego. And obviously, that creates some conflict between him and his, some of his students and whatnot. But this was an important shift. So the ego operates based on reality principle. It helps us with defense mechanisms, and it tries to satisfy the desires of the id without compromising the values of the superego. The superego tends to be our moral compass. It tends to operate based on internalized values of parents and society. So it operates based on a morality principle. And whereas the id seeks instant gratification and pleasure, the superego seeks to defer pleasure. So what's interesting is I describe the ego as sort of like a mediator, because the id and the superego are constantly in battle. So the id wants instant gratification, wants to seek pleasure, does not take into consideration morality, and the superego is trying to delay gratification. So they're going to be at odds at all times. So the ego serving as a balancing, mediating force is going to be very important. Now, here is a drawing that comes out of the textbook, which talks about the id, the ego, and the superego, right? Notice the id is a vast ocean. It's the largest force or largest aspect of the mind. Then you have the ego and superego, which are like an island on top of the id. Now, obviously, most of what's happening is happening beneath the surface. But the ego is sort of like town hall. That's where decision-making happens. And then the superego is symbolically the church, where there's righteousness and morality, right? So these are the three parts of the mind. That is largely accepted. And in fact, we have different brain regions that serve the different functions of the id, ego, and superego. And you could learn about that more in a neuroscience class. So if we're keeping score, Freud's dream analysis is criticized. His personality structure is not criticized. Now we're coming to element number 3 of his theory, which is the psychosexual stages of development. This too is criticized. And Freud believed that we move from, pleasure moves from one erogenous zone to another. And the 5 psychosexual stages are oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. And during each of these stages, there's a major developmental process happening. So the oral stage is typically described as birth to about 18 months. And the general theme is that children are trying to satisfy their basic drives of hunger and thirst. Now, how did people feed in Freud's day? Well, breastfeeding, right? So the breast was the source of the vast majority of pleasure from birth to 18 months. But the biggest challenge you would face is when to take the child off the nipple, when to wean the child off of the breast, right? So if you do it properly, then you have healthy development. But if you take the child off the breast too early, or allow the child to stay on the breast too long, it is possible to develop an oral fixation. Now, a fixation by definition is unresolved conflict or developmental issues from an earlier point in time that reemerge at a later point in time because it was unreconciled. So if there was a problem that was unreconciled in infancy based on breastfeeding, that could manifest later. And a fixation might occur, an oral fixation might be biting your nails, right? Might be chewing on a pen or a straw, might be an eating disorder or a substance use disorder, and so forth. All of these orally related tendencies Freud would argue, are related to an oral fixation. So now you move to the anal stage. The anal stage is stage number 2, and this is roughly 18 months to 3 years. And Freud said pleasure surrounds the anus, which is your primary source of pleasure at this point is getting rid of bodily waste, going to the bathroom. Now, the biggest challenge that you're going to face between 18 months and 3 years, according to Freud, is potty training. Now, if you force your child into potty training too early, or you don't potty train them in an appropriate time, you could develop an anal fixation. And Freud said anal fixations come in 2 forms, such as anal retentiveness or anal expulsiveness. Being anal retentive, we probably have used this terminology in a very cliche, anecdotal way, saying, oh, that person is anal. Well, being anal retentive is being very rigid. Things have to be a certain way. And from a psychological point of view, things like a OCD might be a disorder linked to the anal stage, according to Freud. But you also have the tendency, if a person was not potty trained, that you could have anal expulsiveness, which is where they're super messy, super disorganized. They could engage in things like ADHD, where they're a little more scattered. They could engage in excessive bathroom humor. These might be manifestations of an anal fixation. So Freud would say, make sure that you potty train at the right time. Don't force them too early. Don't allow them to go to the bathroom on themselves too late. So that's timing. Moving to the 3rd stage, this is about 3 to 5 or 3 to 6. So this is the phallic stage. And Freud says that children at the age of 3 start to recognize their genitals, and males recognize that they have a penis, and females recognize that they have a vagina. And according to Freud, females tend to be bothered by the fact that they don't have a penis. And Freud refers to this as penis envy. And girls tend to be jealous of boys because they have a penis. And Now, males, on the other hand, have something called castration anxiety, which is they recognize the power that comes, and I put power in quotes, power that comes from having a penis, and they're at a point where they feel like if they do the wrong thing, they're going to lose their penis. So they have anxiety about castration anxiety, right? So these are, the genitalia and how they map onto this. But Freud also suggested that males have the Oedipus complex. And I'm going to explain this and then link castration anxiety to it. So the Oedipus complex comes from mythology of Oedipus Rex, right? Where he didn't know, but he started to lust after his mother, and his dad became a rival of his. And long story short, Freud takes these ideas and says that males tend to be attracted to their mothers, females tend to be attracted to their fathers. And the parent of the same sex tends to be a rival. And so let's go back into Oedipus complex. A boy at about 3 to 5 or 6 might be attracted to their mother, but what stops them from acting on their attraction? Well, their father is bigger and stronger, and they might castrate them. So instead of going after their mother, they copy their father's behavior, which we call identification, and that results in them getting someone like their mother. That's the theory. And females are the flip side with the Electra complex, where they tend to behave like their mothers, get someone like their father. Now, it's very interesting to think about this, because you're starting to see one of the reasons why this theory is criticized. And that's because this theory tends to be sexist. It implies some form of male superiority based on their genitalia, right? And well, that's sexist, right? And then it also assumes that everybody is heterosexual. So young boys are attracted to their mothers, young girls are attracted to their fathers. But what if a person is attracted to someone of the same sex, right? So it tends to be heterosexist as well. All right. So the conflict is making sure that they don't engage in some socially unacceptable sexual behavior. And then fixations might be vanity, narcissism, or inability to love. Now, the latency stage is roughly when kids go to school at about 5 or 6 till puberty. And then all of a sudden, all of your sex drives are latent. They go beneath the surface, the drives stop, right? And then all of a sudden you start to hang out with same-sex friends and think about recess and whatnot. So there isn't really a conflict or fixation, because there isn't really psychosexual energy happening at that point. But when you have puberty, all of those sex drives come back, and then you channel that towards mature sexual activities. And that's puberty is about 12 or 13 all the way through adulthood. Now, Freud believes that you're capable of mature sexual relationships from puberty forward. Now, he isn't saying that 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds should engage in sexual activities. He's just saying that if you did, the parts work, right? All right. Now, we talked about the ego. The ego reconciles the desires of the id and the morality of the superego. But it also is the place of defense mechanisms. So defense mechanisms are how we cope with stress. And one of the things that the ego does is it distorts reality to some degree to protect you from stress and anxiety, right? So let's talk about some defense mechanisms. Repression. Repression is the process of pushing a traumatic or threatening thought into the unconscious. Now, repression is different than suppression because repression happens automatically. It's your body's natural way of saying, I don't want to deal with it. So if a person was sexually assaulted, they might black out and not remember something, right? And Freud would say that would be due to repression, right? Because their body couldn't deal with it. And he says repression is one of the explanations for PTSD, repressed memories, and false memories. Now, suppression, and I'm going to go to the next slide in a minute. Suppression is a voluntary part. Well, a person who is sexually assaulted may black out. Other people might remember it in painstaking detail. And they might say, you know what, I don't want to deal with this right now. So suppression is the conscious process of pushing it beneath the surface. Now, reaction formation is when you feel one set of feelings but you behave the opposite, right? So imagine you don't like your neighbor and you've been avoiding your neighbor, but one day you come out the door and you lock eyes. So now you're going to have that conversation. You might say, hey, it's so good to see you. Where have you been? And you might feign interest in them, even though you've been avoiding them. Now, why do we do that? Because we don't want to feel like jerks and say, I don't like you, don't talk to me. So we do the opposite. So we see reaction formation as an explanation, as some people are rabidly homophobic, turn out to report themselves as gay males at a later point, or we see it with very religious individuals like clergymen who promote family values, who are secretly, engaging in inappropriate sexual activities, right? So we tend to see this happening. Denial is just saying it's not true. So a person might experience denial if they get a bad grade on a test. They might say, no, it can't be. Or if they become sick, they might say, I want a second opinion. Or if someone dies, they're like, no, right? These are forms of denial because the body isn't ready to cope with it. Projection, this is when a process that you're experiencing, you superimpose on another person. So if you're suspicious of people, you might say, well, why are you so suspicious of another person, when you're just projecting your experiences onto another person? Displacement, again, displacement is taking your frustrations that should be channeled one place and targeting another individual. So this might explain why if you get into some kind of conflict at work, instead of attacking your boss, you might come home and fight with your romantic partner, your parents, your children, your siblings. You might kick the dog, right? Things like that. And why do you pick on your parents or your siblings or your children or your pet? They're a safer target, right? You know that they love you. So instead of going at the source, you go to some safer target. Sublimation is when there's some really distressing experience you're facing. Instead of dealing with it, you channel all your energy into something productive, like writing or work. People are workaholics, might be sublimating sometimes. Regression is when you're dealing with distress, acting in a more childlike manner, because as a child we felt safer perhaps. So you might see, if you have multiple children and a baby comes into the family, the older child might want the bottle again or start wetting the bed again as a way of kind of getting the attention that they used to give. All right, rationalization is justifying inappropriate behavior. So let's say a student was struggling in a class, they might cheat on a test and say, well, it would have been impossible to pass that class without cheating. That's rationalization. All right, so let's apply some of Freud's ideas to unconscious emotions and whatnot. I will tell you that the defense mechanisms is pretty solid, Freud's theory, and we look at it as a pretty valid concept. So Freud suggested that we experience feelings that we don't understand fully cognitively. And that's part of unconscious emotion. So we have feelings that we don't understand or we're not fully aware of. And sure enough, researchers suggest that from a neurological point of view, that some emotional events happen independent of thought. We have excessive memory at times. Now, this is hypermnesia, right? And one of the reasons why we have such hypermnesia is that it serves similar to signal detection theory, right? Which is we're anxious, the alarm bells go off. We remember the times that we were right, but we ignore the false alarms. And that's protective, right? When you think about it, because if there is a true threat, we say, see, I caught that threat. And we reinforce that memory throughout time because of that one time, ignoring the times we were wrong. Now we have infantile amnesia, and that's important because Freud noted that many adults can't remember things from their early years. And in fact, research suggests that our first memories are formed at about the age of 3, and we engage in infantile amnesia for our memories before that. Now, Freud suggested that it's due to trauma, but that's not true. Infantile amnesia happens virtually for all of our memories before the age of 3 due to synaptic pruning and programmed cell death in the brain. Now, memory, all right, memory is imperfect and it's subjective, right? It's based on our conscious recall. He's right about that. And we talk about things like explicit and implicit memory. So explicit memory is our ability to recall or recognize something. Implicit memory is more like a memory that's not consciously recalled, but could influence future behavior. Now, what about amnesia? So psychoanalysis talks about unconscious thought and how it affects behavior. And amnesia was a process of repression or suppression, right? So research does suggest that amnesic patients have demonstrated behavior might be influenced by experience they had that they can't consciously remember. So those are, when we talk about memory and the defense mechanism, those are all the elements. Now, in terms of the psychoanalytic process, right, before the 1800s, you know, there was a very strong emphasis on religion and philosophy. By the 1880s, with Charcot and Freud, they started to focus on the development of the brain and comparisons between human and other animals. And then they started to focus on the unconscious, right? So by the 1890s to 1910s, you start to see Freud develop his ideas of personality structure, dream analysis, psychosexual stages, and whatnot. And then by the 1910s to 1930s, he starts to talk about drives and defense mechanisms. And as I said, during World War I, he develops this death instinct. Now, in the 1930s, Freud was able to escape Vienna and move to England. He winds up dying of cheek and throat cancer. And psychoanalytic thought continues to blossom moving forward. Now, it's important to understand that Freudian psychoanalysis and other approaches really start to differentiate themselves from one another. It becomes very clinical and medical and whatnot. So I'm gonna stop with the timeline there and start to finish up. So if we were to come up with an analogy that would reflect psychoanalytic approach, it would say human beings are analogous to a bundle of sexual and aggressive drives that are contained by civilization. Now, what are some of the advantages of Freudian psychoanalysis? He put an emphasis on childhood and how childhood experiences affect personality and adult-like behavior. He acknowledges the importance of sexual and aggressive drives. He tries to understand the unconscious forces. He explains defense mechanisms, and he acknowledges multiple levels operating in the brain. The limitations to his theory is he tends to be very negative, focuses on pathology. Much of his theory was not subjected to research. He tends to be sexist and heterosexist, and then his approach to dream analysis and psychosexual stages are significantly challenged. Freud believed in psychical determinism, which means that there is no free will. We are directly influenced by our drives and conflicts, but we don't have free will. Now, how do you do assessment in this model? Well, psychotherapy, free association, say whatever comes to mind, dream analysis, these would be your ability to tap into personality and the unconscious. And in terms of implications for therapy, because personality problems result from deep inner conflicts, real change occurs when you spend a lot of time working on it. So therapy tends to be long-term and insight-oriented. And if you look at psychoanalysis, traditional analysis is 5 times a week, and you might stay with a therapist for years or an analyst for years. And that's how you get to these greater insights. And that, in a nutshell, is Freudian psychoanalysis and his understanding for personality. Now I'm going to stop there. And next lesson will be on Neo-Freudian. So we're now going to talk about the theories of personality that emerge as a function of Freud, many of which are deviations from his traditional belief set. So till next time, everybody.